Hello, and welcome again to another episode of Muview with Mo. Today, I am here with my friend, Dr. Rachel Rotz, who over this past summer defended her PhD and now has a new academic posting. So we're here both to celebrate that and to talk about her research and background. Rachel, I'll hand it over to you to introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Morrison, for that really nice introduction. Yes, it feels really good to be done with my PhD and moving forward onto a new position. I had a lot of quiet time to really focus on finishing the dissertation over the end of the spring and the summer, so that was really nice. I enjoyed my dissertation topic very much. My dissertation was entitled The Geomorphic and Geologic Indicators in Drylands at Zones of Hydrologic Flux on both Earth and Mars. And in a nutshell, that is studying water in deserts on Earth and other planets as well, and what we can learn about the geologic and the geomorphic characteristics, what those characteristics can tell us about water, because obviously we can't see very much water in deserts, but we know that it was there, or at least there at some time in the past.
Yeah, that it's there and that it shapes both the subsurface and the surface.
Right.
And continues to shape, not just shapes in the past, but continues in ongoing processes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic, and one part that I focused on with my dissertation was the interdisciplinary nature of a dissertation topic like this, because it allows you to sort of approach it from lots of different disciplines. You can look at it from a geomorphological perspective, a geological perspective, a hydrogeological perspective, a purely planetary perspective. You can sort of be a jack or Jane of all trades and try to sort of broadly umbrella all of those topics like I did, or you can really go deep in one of the areas and be specific. So it really lends itself to lots of disciplines as well as lots of approaches. So you can use satellite remote sensing, field techniques. You can also do physical, analytical, and numerical modeling as well. So there's just lots of different techniques that you can use to do this research as well as disciplines.
One thing that I remember both from seeing you at work in your lab at UGA and from some of your social media posts is that you do some different flume and other hydrologic model experiments. And those are always kind of neat to look at, the big kind of devices where you can model how water is moving through different sediment types and kind of the physics of certain ways that water moves both on the surface and the subsurface. And those are always fun to watch, I feel.
Yeah, I think those are really important tools, especially physical models, which are sort of, most of us have seen physical models in really small scales. There's a classroom groundwater hydrogeology model that's in almost every, geology classroom at every university on the planet probably that we all know of. And, there have been really interesting physical models that have been created since the turn of the, 20th century with especially water-related things. But it's not just used for an instructional tool. It's also really powerful to use to do research, especially when you're trying to build a conceptual framework about how something actually functions. And so building a physical model, even like a big one like I built for my master's, which was 6 feet long by 1 meter wide, and being able to simulate what's happening in the subsurface, videotape that, and then analyze those videos and collect your own data and analyze your own statistics, and then compare that to what's happening in the real world is a really important research tool for, trying to characterize something that's really never been characterized before in literature, or introducing new parameters.
One topic that controls and guides a lot of your research, we think of different fields of science. There are certain kind of controlling ideas that we think about things like paleontology. We think about major evolutionary transitions. In your topic of hydrology, I know that a lot of your research is framed around critical zone systems. Would you like to explain kind of what the critical zone is and why that's kind of an increasing area of focus for research, both here on Earth and, as you do, also on other planets?
Sure. So the critical zone is the area of the Earth, or at least the Earth critical zone, which is the original, the OG critical zone, is the area from the lower atmosphere all the way to the bottom of the groundwater column. So this is loosely all of the biological, chemical, geological processes that are happening, the interaction of these processes that are happening that supports the life system and just the natural system of that area. So like my dissertation topic, critical zone science is also very interdisciplinary because it can bring in lots of different disciplines together to study a specific topic or a group of topics within that critical zone column. And so Dr. Paul Schroeder, who is a clay mineralogist at the University of Georgia that we both know, he does a lot of critical zone science work. He's played an integral part with the Critical Zone Observatory, and he's working with his PhD student Laura Fackrell and another one of his graduate students and myself when we were working on characterizing the critical zone of Mars, and also trying to sort of put the topic of a critical zone network on Mars out there to explain how the critical zone network on Earth is working and how possibly we could, create a critical zone network on Mars.
Nice, nice. And I would assume that would be a critical zone network of little unmanned sensors left behind by rovers or stuff like that?
It's actually a combination of things. So rovers are one of the nodes of the network. You can also incorporate any kind of planetary orbiting body, like a satellite, like the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. If we ever have any manned missions, we can also incorporate those. And so the idea is to run simultaneous projects, either at differing locations or the same project or multiple projects at one location, so that you can sort of compare and contrast data and use several different approaches to do that research. And so like on Earth, we use satellite systems like Landsat. We have critical zone observatory sites on Earth where, critical zone research is being conducted, and then university nodes. So it sort of builds a network.
Mm-hmm. And kind of moving a little bit closer to home to Earth's critical zone system, you mentioned the critical zone observatories. And if I recall correctly, which I very well may not, those are about 20-ish field sites maintained by USGS and USGS collaborators, like the critical zone in that agricultural field near UGA that I know you guys do some work with.
The Calhoun site, yeah, and it's a U.S. NSF national program, and so there are several sites, and Paul's been pretty active at the one in Calhoun. There's also the Shales Hill Critical Zone Observatory up at north of State College out there by Penn State, and there are, I don't know, yeah, I'm not sure what the number is, but it's definitely more than 10 or so nodes in the United States alone, and potentially also in like South America, where we have these NSF-sponsored CZO observatory or critical zone observatories, and now NSF is sort of moving towards the network aspect of it. So we're really looking at how can we connect the different observatories together to leverage the research.
Getting into some of that big data type thought.
Yeah. So it'll be really interesting to see how that evolves and how my research evolves with that. It was really exciting to be a part of defining or contributing to the definition of a Mars critical zone from a groundwater perspective or hydrology perspective.
Oh, glad to learn a little bit more about your research. Kind of building back on that, would you like to talk a little bit about some of your personal background and kind of your personal journey to now where you are as an assistant professor?
Well, I had did my first undergraduate degree in liberal studies. So my area of focus was fine arts, so painted. And I also had interest in philosophy and writing. And those are what I focused on for my first undergraduate degree. And then I went out into the brave new world, and I worked in a lot of different kinds of jobs. And, one of the really nice things about liberal arts degrees is they teach you how to effectively communicate through writing and in my case, visual arts. And so on top of being a critical thinker, because of my philosophy background, I was also a good communicator. So I didn't have a hard time navigating the world with a liberal arts undergraduate degree. But after being out there for a while, I was just always inspired by space and planetary science and even environmental science. And I really wanted to go back and pursue those passions. So I decided to go back for another undergraduate degree in science. And my liberal arts degree served me well for preparing me to go into science, because there is a lot of writing and there's a lot of figure making that we have to do, and it's good to have those communication skills going into a science degree. And so I stayed at UGA to complete my master's and my PhD. And the lab that I was in was a arid environment water resources lab. And from the early on, I'd always kind of saw a parallel between researching deserts on Earth to potentially researching Mars. So it was a long game goal of mine from, doing undergraduate research in the Water Resources and Remote Sensing Lab at UGA to being able to investigate Mars. And I think it was finally by the time my PhD rolled around, I had convinced my advisor that doing planetary work was a worthy cause. And so he let me go pursue that, which I'm really thankful that I had that opportunity, that I was able to do that. And so the research has evolved, but it also sort of it diverges in a lot of different directions too. And so, I'm doing water resources research in arid environments on Earth. One of my projects focused on water resources in Kuwait, another one focused on water resources in Australia, and then I'm also, looking at potential locations for groundwater accumulation on Mars, where we think mostly ground ice exists today. So I'm, branching in these three different directions at the moment, and we will see where that takes me. I'm down in South Florida right now, where there are a lot of water resources issues and environmental problems, and so I'm certain that I'm going to be pulled in that direction pretty heavily. And so it'll be interesting to see and learn, about coastal hydrology and how that's different from arid environment hydrology, and how I can apply the skills that I learned with my PhD to the new research.
Maybe starting to branch into a little bit into the juicy world of limnology and karst geomorphology.
Yeah, there's a limnologist on staff here, and he's been very curious about what I'm doing and been kind enough to include me in some projects already. So that's sort of exciting. We're looking at remediation of some canal water. I don't know if you're real familiar with southwestern Florida, but many of the houses here are on canals and they boat out to the Gulf. And so there's a lot of nutrient runoff from residential locations, as well as the huge agricultural industry that's here in the heart of the northern Everglades. And so there's a huge water quality issue with Lake Okeechobee and its two major drainage arteries, one being the Caloosahatchee River, which is where I live, right off of by the Gulf. And all of this nutrients is flowing into these canal systems and out to the Gulf, which is creating a lot of blue-green algae. It's possible, although it hasn't been proven, that the red algae or the red tide, which is very toxic to animals, including human beings, is somehow related to the increase in the blue-green algae blooms, although we don't know for sure. Certainly related to temperature, sea temperature rise. But there's lots of interesting things to get into. There's the mangroves down here, which are just absolutely stunningly beautiful and such an important part of buffering the land from hurricanes and also controlling water quality. So I'm really excited to kind of be down here and see where this goes.
Kind of on the ground floor of groundwater.
Yeah. It's interesting. And, I do surface and groundwater. So technically I'm a hydrogeologist, but my work includes surface water, which is nice. So I've got some flexibility there on what I focus on.
And just to clarify for our non-geologist audience members, I referred earlier to limnology and karst geomorphology, and basically those are the sciences and studies of limestone basement rock and the processes that shape how water flowing through limestone produces things like caves, sinkholes, and other things related to the flow of water through limestone and how it shapes both the underground and the surface. And those are very relevant topics for Florida, which is basically an entire state over a spongy mattress of limestone.
Yeah. It's more like a Swiss cheese like foundation.
Keep that in mind, Florida real estate developers.
I'm telling you, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine that was down here the other day because he was talking about sinkholes, and I explained to her like what's actually happening underground. I'm like, we're just sitting on like a Swiss, a block of Swiss cheese that's pretty soft. And she was like, oh my goodness.
Somewhat relatedly, another source of sinkholes that a very different part of the world with very different geology is experiencing is, have you done any reading about Siberian sinkholes?
Are those the ones that are methane induced?
There are methane induced ones, but there are also other ones where the mechanism is a little bit less well known. But basically, in both cases, what's going on is that the permafrost and tundra in Siberia is starting to melt, which is releasing gases like methane, causing huge surface collapses, and these huge ground holes just open up, just like the karstic sinkholes in like Florida and other parts of the U.S.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting with climate change. There's
Yeah.
a lot of things that we're going to see within the next 100 years that we probably haven't seen before.
One thing that you also alluded to in kind of your backstory is you talked about how scientists wear a lot of hats, that scientists are writers, scientists design figures, and so they have to, think a little bit about artistry and design. Scientists are also educators. Scientists are also statisticians. And, there's a lot of different hats that we have to wear as scientists, and that's always, it gives us lots of room to grow, but also lots of things that we need to work on. And that's kind of a good thing.
Yeah, it's funny. I've heard professors talk about how I used to have a secretary type up my paper, or, we used to hire, an illustrator to do our figures for us. And, in some ways, it must have been nice to be able to just focus on one thing. However, I can't even imagine what that would be like today. I do think that there is an opportunity, though, for graphic artists and for illustrators to get involved in science, and we don't have to rely so much on our own abilities to do everything. There are a lot of freelance artists. You can find a lot of different websites out there where there are freelance artists for hire that will illustrate and sketch for you if you have a conceptual idea. I think this is really handy, especially if you're going to be making figures for like a book, or you're trying to characterize an environment and that's missing from the literature. I mean, if you look at some of the older figures that are out there, they're very nicely done, these three-dimensional figures. And, not always did the scientists always make these. And so I think we're trying to sort of replicate things that, we may not necessarily be 100% qualified to do. So I encourage using artists to help support the work if you can afford it, if you can somehow get it in the budget and make it work. I think that there's some opportunities there to include art and science in many different ways, and that's just one way that we can do that and make our work better.
Certainly, as a person on the paleo side of things, there's obviously a vibrant and very contributory environment of paleo artists who are working in conjunction with scientists to really help us visualize so much of that particular aspect of the science so well. And the same holds up with other aspects too. And sometimes it can be kind of fun and silly. A number of years back, there were these Japanese biologists who were working on identifying some sort of very interesting novel cellular protein. And their work was significant enough that it was the cover article for an issue of the journal Cell, one of the big journals in their field. And their article being a cover article means that they got to choose kind of the cover picture. And they actually hired a very famous manga author to produce a very funny image for the cover of it, where basically it's like an anthropomorphized version of the protein beating up on like some bacteria or something.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's fun. It's a good way to sort of engage, your readers and your students, and why not? I mean, we should make science fun. It should be something that more of us engage in, and I think it's it's important that we can do the quantitative heavy lifting, and that we know how to communicate our data in meaningful ways. I think that is our job, but I think it's also our job to be able to communicate the whole picture effectively, and also be able to present it in a way that's not only informative but also attractive and appealing to people, because we want people to be drawn into our work and to look at it and to learn from it.
Kind of on that note, in terms of figure design and making sure that our figures are accessible to everyone, one thing that I like talking about, and I'm glad that we're kind of moving into that so I can mention it here, is that, there's more and more thought being put into inclusive figure design. And one of the easiest ways to go about doing that is to design figures that are readable to people with color blindness or other color deficiencies. When I'm making figures, I use a program called Color Oracle. That's basically a little plugin that I can run where it will set my screen to replicate the effects of different common types of color deficiency, so I can see how the colors that I'm using in my figures would be read by people who have different vision than I do. And so how can I, then go back and manipulate the figures so that way it's clear. And so I like telling people about Color Oracle as a way of as promoting more inclusive figure design.
Yeah, I like that idea. You always kind of been taught the basics. If you're using, two lines on a graph, make one dotted, make one solid. Even if you're using two different colors, people may not be able to see, those two colors. And so I appreciate that. And this might be a little bit out there, but I've always, and I haven't tried this yet, but I've always had this desire to turn my data into an auditory experience.
Oh, that's pretty neat.
Yeah, so I had a friend of mine from Athens that was a musician. He was really getting into this. It's probably about 5 years or ago, maybe 5 years or longer, maybe gosh, about 6 years. But he's out at Berkeley now. He's a professor out there. But he was taking data from science data, putting into programs where it would generate different tones for different data values, and you sort of can control your tonal scale. And then what you do is you sort of put your data in there and you play your data, and it, the tones can get higher along with the numerical values, and you can do a lot of cool things with that. And I haven't done it yet. And if you're really into it, we should try to do something together. There are a lot of free programs out there where you can put different data. It doesn't even have to be a really big data set. It can be something small, and run it through the sound system and see what kind of sounds you can generate. I mean, from an artistic point, this is really interesting, but it's also great for people that can actually see the data. It's another way for them to listen to what's happening and potentially have some different interpretations from it.
I've heard some similar stories of such techniques being applied to astronomy data, and that's been kind of neat to hear about and learn a little bit more about.
Yeah, like listening to like two black holes, or listening to wind and things.
Yeah, listening to the cosmic background radiation.
So cool.
Here at Virginia Tech, our sedimentology professor, Dr. Brian Romans, I've taken a couple of his classes, and he does a very good job of incorporating programs like R and other software into the lessons to help us, both undergrads and grad students, learn a little bit more about these very useful both statistical analysis and graphic design programs. And he introduced me to something very interesting, that there's actually a Tumblr account called R Art. I'd have to look up the exact link to it, but it's basically an interesting little repository of very visually interesting data presentations created using R.
I'll have to check that out. Yeah, there's a Reddit subreddit that's about, I think it's like graphic design is
that Data is Beautiful?
Data is Beautiful, yeah, that's what it is. Yeah, and that one's pretty good too, it's kind of neat. But I'll have to check out the Tumblr one. That sounds good.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've taken a look at it, but I remember looking at it and thinking it looks pretty slick.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of R. I was introduced to it by C. Holland, and he, presented a very good foundational course. And, being a time series person and also being a hydrology person, I've branched off and been able to use R for lots of different things, which has been really cool. And it's a great tool for satellite remote sensing image processing. It can do all the things that Python and IDL and a lot of those software out there can do, plus more. I'm a big fan of R. I know a lot of people like MATLAB too, and I say learn them all if you can. Why not? But yeah, R is pretty awesome.
Yeah, I have a little bit of experience with R, and through Brian Romans, I've done a little bit with Python. I'll admit I've never touched MATLAB, and so I'll have to get around to learning some of that someday.
Yeah. So I enjoy R. I try to. I made this recommendation, and I do it myself. And whenever I'm bored and I need like my brain to just not focus on, well, for my dissertation, I would just sort of like do some R coding for fun on something completely unrelated to my dissertation. So one of the things that I learned how to do with R code is called web scraping, where you can like scrape tables off of a website and then bring them in as data frames and then do your own analysis. And so like ever since COVID started, for example, websites that actually present the data as a table on their web pages can be very easily scraped. You can scrape multiple pages by creating like a loop, and then you can build like a national COVID data set by just scraping a website and getting the data up to date at any time. And so I like to, and I always encourage people, if you really want to learn some new things with our programming, like create a little hobby on something completely unrelated to your work for fun, and learn how to code something completely different from what you're doing, just to push your skill set.
Mm-hmm. It's a researcher that I work with here at Virginia Tech, also coincidentally named Rachel. This is actually similarly initialed RR, Rachel Reed.
Oh, cool.
She helps run our stable isotope lab. She gave me a very nice online R textbook that sometimes I go through very slowly. It's basically teaching you about some of the finer points of using the R package ggplot to make better graphs. And every couple of months I will like check out like 10 or 15 pages of it at a time to try to brush up on some R skills.
Yeah, just something new and different. Like, ooh, that graph looks really cool. Could I create that?
Yeah, yeah. Or it's
Yeah,
like so here at Virginia Tech, every year we have a graduate student symposium, the GSRS, Geoscience Student Research Symposium, or sometimes we fiddle around a little bit with what the acronym stands for. But last year was a big anniversary year for that, and I was in charge of making some of the historical documentation of it, including some graphs of like what all kinds of topics were covered, which all professors had, how many students presented in these topics, and that was a great little excuse for me to get in a little bit more practice with R.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great tool, and only see it kind of gaining in popularity. And I mean, there's a lot of really interesting packages. There's a hydrology package out there in R. The USGS has a package set up if you want to download gauge data from any station. It's pretty easy to install and run data. It's a really useful tool. I'll certainly be incorporating R into a lot of my classes. Like Microsoft Excel, I really think that it's never too early for students to start, becoming familiarized. I taught as an instructor of record last summer at University of Georgia an introductory geology class to incoming freshmen, a program they do called Fresh Code there. And I had, brand new undergraduate students, very first class at a university ever, open up their laptops and open up Excel, and they were not happy about it. And they were very vocal that they don't like Excel, but we did spreadsheets, and we got through it. And it was important to me that they start seeing these things early, and I don't see why we can't get programming in there early on too. There is a way to teach it where it doesn't have to be so intimidating,
When I was doing my undergraduate degrees at UGA, I remember distinctly a number of my chemistry classes did some very interesting things with Excel that I learned a lot about, like data importation and other ways to use Excel that I didn't have a lot of experience with. So I was glad about that. I did a little bit of R in some classes at UGA, but that is one thing that I wish more of my undergraduate classes had delved into was using R and other programs like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think geology as a discipline is really a little bit behind with that, and I feel like we need to do a better job incorporating some of those advanced tools in early. I mean, we want students to be able to understand complex problems, and that means that sometimes we have to deal with a lot of data, or we have to, deal with statistical methods early on and really get them thinking about what it is. I mean, I don't know, I didn't take a stats class when I was an undergrad. That wasn't required. And so, really kind of struggled with it with my master's and finally got over the hump, but it would have been nice to really, have been encouraged to really, be proficient in statistics, at least linear statistics, and just be able to do that. So, or linear modeling, to be able to do that and not have to fumble through the dark and learn it on my own,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that programming and using computer simulations, and I mean, just even also learning about, scientific writing and the publication process or the peer review process, and sort of how the consensus of scientific information comes to be is really important discussions that we need to start having with students really early on, especially in today's political climate, where facts are literally being thrown out the window, and we're being told that our information, our data is malarkey. I mean, and that is a really easy argument to cling to, and I really think it's important that we need to, unfortunately, start having conversations again about exactly what the scientific method is, what it was like on this planet before science prevailed, and how people operated and the belief systems that we operated within, and the transition from that time to a time of science, and how this thinking, this using science as a way to sort of explain the objective world, is how we are able to use things like iPhones and pacemakers and do open heart surgery and all of these things that we take for granted that would not exist if we weren't using science to progress as a society. And it's sad that we have to have this conversation, but I really think we need to start talking about what happened during the Renaissance and what was happening before, and why we are a science-based species at the moment, and why that is really important if we want to continue moving forward, progressing our society, why we need science, and we're not going backwards into some sort of dark age kind of idea about what is going on, right now. So, yeah, it's something that's been on my mind, and it's something that I'm trying to really figure out how to incorporate next semester with my students in my, introduction to geology, physical geology class. I really want to have these conversations with them. I think it's important.
Nice. Kind of meditating a little bit on the thought of science and its communication to the public. I'd like to talk a little bit now about kind of one of the broad themes of this podcast, and that's museums. And if you could talk a little bit about some of the museums that you either work with or that you have particularly enjoyed going to and learning from.
Well, my grandparents were from New York. They lived in Queens, and so I was very lucky to be dragged around the Natural Museum of Art and History when I was very young, and got to see some amazing exhibits in New York City, and was very inspired by that as a young child. I enjoy art museums as well. I've been to Paris, and I've been to the Louvre.
Nice.
Been to Guggenheim, and I enjoy looking at, the great artists from the past, and I think that those are really important. Atlanta has a really beautiful museum there, Fernbank Museum, which I believe Scott Harris has been doing. I don't know if you follow him. He's been doing a lot of Friday night shows from Fernbank, a lot of Mars-related shows. So I would definitely like to let people know if they're interested in, seeing some things on Friday night about Mars from Fernbank. Check out Scott Harris's Facebook page, follow him, and get on there. He's interviewing some interesting people. And then, my dissertation work was sponsored by the National Air and Space Museum with the Smithsonian. So one of my committee members and colleagues, Bob Craddock, he supported my trip to Australia and the research that I did out there. And certainly, I think they do some amazing work out there, and they do a wonderful job supporting students in both internships, summer internships, as well as postdoc positions for PhD graduates, and then a pre-doc, which is when master students graduate. It's almost like a postdoc position, but they call it, I think it's a pre-doc. They have that program as well. So they do a really, really good job out there. And so those are just a few of my affiliations with museums and my experiences. But certainly the one out in Atlanta, I think, is worth taking a look at. They're doing a great job. Scott's doing a great job keeping the fire burning during all of this.
What are some museums that you'd like to visit but you haven't had the chance to yet?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm trying to, I've never been to the Mineral Museum in Georgia, the one that is, what's the name of it?
The TELUS Science Center?
Yes.
Yeah, TELUS is great. TELUS is great.
And I've always wanted to go because I heard their mineral collection is amazing.
Yeah, the Weissman or Weinman, the Weinman mineral collection is really spectacular. One great thing that they have out on display is this huge amethyst geode, I believe from Brazil, that they have it opened up, and the whole thing is taller than I am if I were to stretch my hands directly above my head. It's huge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't believe I never went to that museum. Spending all the time up there, but this definitely has been on my list for a really long time.
One thing that I really like about a couple of things that I really like about the TELUS Museum is that they have some very nice, generally at any given time, they have two small rotating exhibits. One's kind of a general science exhibit. It's been a couple of different things. I've seen one exhibit in that space where it was photography of abandoned airports that was very interesting. And at another time, it was winning Georgia State Science Fair projects. And so it has an interesting little rotation there. And then they have another little rotating exhibit attached to their mineral collection where it's different, generally local mineral collections. They have one where it's like gemstones of the Southeast. At another time, they did a very interesting little exhibit on the history of the granite and marble industry of Georgia, which
That's
it was
pretty cool.
Yeah, it was pretty neat to see some of the different things where different Georgia materials have ended up there. I remember one of the funny things that stuck out to me about that particular exhibit, and is a little bit topically relevant now, is that in the very early days when the Georgia granite industry was first getting developed in the early 1900s in Elberton, as you can imagine, there were a number of people who were using the stone to make Confederate monuments. Basically, the first Confederate monument that was made using Georgia granite was a statue of a Confederate soldier made for the town of Elberton. But the twist is that it was made by this Italian sculptor who evidently wasn't very good. And so they made kind of short, squat, dumpy man of a statue that these, lost cause espousing Southern Georgians who had commissioned the Civil War secessionist soldier statue, they hated it so much that in like 1906, they tore it down and buried it in the ground.
Oh my goodness.
It was dug back, and they thought it was so ugly they called it Dutchy because they thought it looked more like some Dutchman than an actual Southern soldier. It was dug up back in the 80s, and they literally put it through a car wash, and now it is stored at the Elberton Granite Museum.
Yeah, it's interesting from a geological perspective to think about the statues in the South. I mean, I bet you a lot of statues came from the granite in Elberton in that area.
Yeah, and not just statues, but gravestones and grave markers. Georgia granite is used all over the place for that sort of material.
Yeah,
in ways that are thankfully far more innocuous than that.
Right, yeah.
One thing that I talked about was the U.S. Capitol building. Certain portions of it, when they were renovated throughout the 1900s, were renovated using Georgia material, which is kind of neat. I believe some of the building material of the building around the Lincoln Memorial is also from Georgia originally.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Another museum I'm trying to get to is the lynching and the museum and memorial in Montgomery, Alabama. Have you heard about that?
No, not specifically.
Yeah, it's a museum that sort of goes through and it archives a lot of the slaves that were killed over time, and it has their names and where they're from, and so you can actually go and see. And it's a pretty powerful museum from what I've heard. My boyfriend went, he talked about it. He's trying to get me to go with him. That's in Montgomery, and it sounds pretty interesting.
I have kind of a funny story about an art museum that I wanted to go to, but I ultimately didn't get the chance to, and maybe you'll get a little kick out of it. So through a UGA program one summer, I spent about a month in South Korea, where I was essentially there with a number of other UGA undergrads to kind of polish some Catholic high school boys' English skills. And I had a couple of days off at different times and was able to spend 2 days kind of on my own in Seoul. So I got to go around and see a lot of different museums and places. There's a lot of neat stuff in Seoul to just go around and see, including the Samsung Art Museum, where the Samsung family of the electronics fame, as you might expect from some wealthy industrialists, they have quite an art collection to their name. And so that's housed in a major museum in Seoul. But unfortunately, I timed it improperly. And the one day of the week that the museum was closed was the day that I had allotted to go see that while I was in Seoul.
Man. Bummer.
Yeah, so if I ever get my way back into South Korea, that's definitely something I'd like to go see, is the Seoul Art Museum.
Yeah, definitely gotta just check the schedule next time.
Yeah, because certain other museums were open, and I was able to go see those, thankfully.
Is it your goal to eventually end up working for a museum, or would you like to be a professor? Have you decided what you're gonna do?
That's a good question. It's I've always kind of struggled to imagine what exactly I want to do in the future of employment after I get my PhD and go on from there. It's right now I'm leaning more towards becoming a professor where I have a little bit more direct teaching role. But there are good and useful things that I could do at a museum as well.
Yeah, and there's a lot of outreach you can do and mentoring of students, and I've seen that with the Smithsonian. I mean, there's my colleague Bob, he's great. He's a great teacher, and he includes a lot of students in his work, and he's done a good job getting us really passionate about planetary science. I see that in those roles can be be really really powerful and influential.
Now comes the part of the show where I like to talk about media, and I'm wondering, this is perhaps a little bit of an ask, but can you think of any examples of media, be it books, literature, or art, that present geological topics or even hydrology specific topics to the public that you think either do a good job or don't do a particularly good job?
Yeah, I mean, are we talking fiction? Are we talking nonfiction? Or
Fiction or nonfiction?
well, there's a book that I read a few years ago. Actually, I have it, called The Water Knife. It's by Paolo Bagagalupi. I know I'm just butchering the last name there, but it's called The Water Knife, and it takes place in the future, and it's out west, and there are water wars between states because of the dwindling water resources supplies. And so it's a fictitious story about a person that is trying to sort of navigate the cutthroat political situation that is a result of dwindling water resources. It's really good. I mean, it's a little kind of a detective-y kind of story, and it can kind of be a little cheesy at times, but it's speculative fiction, and I think that it does a really good job of going down a potential path in the future that we might actually face if given some decisions and situations. If they turned out that way, we could very realistically be going down. So I like that book. That's a water one. Trying to think about geology. Gosh, there was a book that I read. My memory is just gone. There was a book that I read about like extreme environments not too long ago. There was one guy who had traveled to all of these different environments, including deserts and mountains, and explored everywhere. And he wasn't a scientist, but he had explained what he had done, and it was really, really cool. And if I could come up with the name off the top of my head, I would. But yeah, so that was a really good geology related book. Trying to think. I'm like looking at my books here, but I really should just be thinking of my favorite books that I like to read. I've been really into Jeff Vandermeer books lately. He he wrote Annihilation, which became a movie recently, sort of an alien.
Yeah, kind of that Lovecraftian. What's the series? What's the series called?
I think that book's The Annihilation. It's Area X anthology, I think.
Yeah,
It sort of takes place in like the southern coastal environment. He's inspired by like the Gulf Coast, the St. Mark's Wildlife Refuge, and he's a Florida writer, and he writes a lot about nature and the environment. And again, it's a speculative fiction genre. But I've really been into his books lately. The book Annihilation is definitely hands down way better than the movie, so I would certainly recommend. It's very different. Checking out the book, but it has a team of scientists that come in to sort of investigate this phenomenon that no one can explain, and they get sort of wrapped up in it, and it's alien of nature because it's able to kind of manipulate physics in a way that we've never seen before. So it's a really good book.
Tangentially related, earlier this year I got an audiobook collection of H.P. Lovecraft material, and the Color Out of Space, which shares a lot of DNA with Annihilation. I guess you could tangentially say it's hydrology related because part of it's about well contamination.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So.
yeah. There's another book that I read. I think it's not. Paolo Baglucci or whatever. He also wrote a book called The Wind-Up Girl, which is really good. Which takes place. I don't remember which country it is in Asia. It might be Korea. But it could just be another smaller area in China where sea level rise has occurred, and everybody is trying to cope with, unsustainable resources in terms of energy and a lot of flooding and things, and AI and the progress that like AI has made where they have individual, AI beings, and they're trying to navigate in this world where the environment is completely changed and different, and in genetic engineering has changed, and that's a really interesting book. That's called The Wind-Up Girl. That's pretty good too.
I think I've heard vaguely that setup sounds familiar.
Yeah, that's a really good one. I don't know. Speculative fiction is my favorite genre to read. I'm very interested in sort of seeing the different places, different paths that can, we could eventually go down, with given the advancement of technology and climate change, which kind of seems to be the, two sort of broad themes that sort of create all these situations for humans to have to, navigate in. So
It creates a lot of that nice, juicy narrative conflict for us.
yeah, yeah. So
Is
I
it man versus
definitely
nature, or is it really just man versus society from a different angle?
man versus themselves, I mean, we are, nature's doing its thing, right? I mean, it's not, in my opinion, it's not conscious, and it's just it's an order, a very complex ordering system that is going to do what it's going to do, and we're sort of trying to survive within it and trying to control it, but you know
There is a great quote, and unfortunately, I always forget who said it, but I know it was a scientist who I believe worked for the USGS, but she said, society exists by geological consent.
Oh yeah, I know that was Will Durant. I know that actually. That was Will Durant. He wrote. I just saw that quote the other day. He wrote The Age of Faith and the Renaissance. Like he and his wife, I believe, they tried to actually write the complete history of man. Like they felt like it wasn't curated and it wasn't put in a like a wasn't put in a set of books that really allow people to read it. But actually, I look at Will Durant's work because I'm really interested in what he wrote about Leonardo da Vinci, and he talks a lot about the introduction of science into society and the transition and the fight between religion and science. And he writes a lot about that. So, yeah, Will Durant, yeah, it's pretty cool.
So you talked a little bit about art and your background with art. What kind of art do you appreciate and do you enjoy going out and seeing and experiencing?
I really like abstract art. I appreciate artists that can do, realism and can recreate, I mean, it's just an amazing skill. And I love looking at that. And I've always admired that. But I really like abstract art. I feel like it sort of evokes the imagination a bit. It's really there for your interpretation. So it's very subjective and it can be fun and it's really colorful, and so I enjoy that. I really like, I love Salvador Dali and some of the, the impressionists. I like new weird things too, experimental art and artists kind of trying to do different things like making art with their bodies or just different conceptual art. So I'm really into more, I guess, modern, modern, postmodern art movement. But, I appreciate all kinds of art, I think, in the end. I'm always just discovering new things that people are doing. They're just incredible.
I was at a museum once where I got to get up close to a Mondarian. I believe I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, but the guy who did those paintings of kind of the big blocky colors.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember not being like super into that before, but I remember getting to see it up close. One thing that's not captured in a lot of the pictures and other presentations of it, but it's very textured. Like it's much more a physical medium than I had thought that it was. And I remember after getting to see it and appreciate it up close that I had a much greater degree of appreciation for that particular piece and kind of that genre of abstract art than I did before getting to see it up close.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an added dimension that you didn't really think existed, right? Because that art can be interpreted as a very simple 2D
very
kind of
simple,
thing.
very flat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you again for joining us today, Rachel. I'm glad that you could come on.
Definitely. Thanks for the invitation. I really enjoyed myself.
So tell me, Rachel, what bird do you think you share a wingspan with?
A wingspan? Oh, good God. That's a really good question. I have a bird that I share a sing span with.
A similar vocal range?
Well, I really like the pied butcher, which is an Australian bird. If you ever have a chance to listen to its song, it is very eerie and dark and beautiful. And so I heard this bird when I was doing field work out in Australia and absolutely fell in love with it. It's the most beautiful bird song I ever have. I share a bird sing span more than I can think of wingspan at this moment.